Hey folks, Rob here with another Initial Recce for you. This one's going to be ASL scenario number 145, Shanghai in Flames. It's a nice little scenario, 6.5 turns, takes about 4.5, 5 hours to play. Designed by Kevin Myers. So let's get into the Recce. So 27 October 1937 is the date of the scenario, and that's important for the primary reason that no quarter is typically standard for Japanese missions. However, that only starts from 38 onward. It takes place in Shanghai, China, and it features the Imperial Japanese Army versus the Nationalist Chinese fighting around the Four Bank Warehouse in Shanghai. As I said, 6.5 turns, and Scenario Archive estimates about 5 hours or so to play, five and a bit. I think Dave and I did this in 4.5, so it's quite doable in an afternoon. Uses two half boards, 1 and 20, and row Q is not in play. Looking at Scenario Archive, there's actually three different versions of this scenario. Right, so the first one we have is from ASL13 Rising Sun. This is the one that Dave and I played, and from what I can tell, the only difference between this and the earlier version is an extra squad that's been added to the attacker. I assume that's an extra first line unit. Uh, there's an earlier version made in Avalon Hill, as well as another one that came out from Multiman Publishing. But again, look at the stats. All of them tend to favor the Chinese. This one here, the latest one's a 25 to 16 for the Chinese, and the only recorded play so far is the one that I posted. And hopefully more people will start doing that as this game gets played. If you're hearing this for the first time and you do this, make sure that you log your games on aslscenarioarchive.com, just because it's a good way for other players to view how things go. Obviously, the reason why it's an 8 rating is because I gave it one. So that's, I think, pretty good. It's a nice little fun little scenario. Some of the older versions give you slightly different odds for the Chinese win loss, but it's still stacked towards the Chinese. I don't think it matters which version you're looking at. So there is one scenario replay which is posted there. I think it's for the other multi-man publishing one, which has a comment that the balance should be given to the Japanese, which means the Chinese will not get their three fortifications for the fortified building, which makes it a little bit easier. Well, it makes it a lot easier for the Japanese because they can just bum rush the factory when normally you'd have to sit outside and whittle away the defenses before you can actually gain entrance. Now, historically, the Chinese did win this real life mission, and the victory condition is quite simple. The Japanese have to control building 20E7, which is the large factory, in the bottom right corner. There's some important rules that you have to be aware of. Obviously, if you've never played PTO before, you need to know about the Banzai ability of the Japanese, as well as how their squads work, which is called step reduction or striping. And this sees the full-size squads never break. All they are is reduced in firepower, hence the name step reduced. And you could eventually whittle them down to half squads, which can break. But until you get to that point, but we're going to cover all of that shortly. You also need to know your factory rules. Again, ground floor locations only. There's no cellars or rooftops in play. Those are typically only by the hassles. There are interior LOS hindrances of +1 per hex between the fire and target, not inclusive. So, for example, if we had a fire here in D7 and he wants, or D6, and he wants to fire at D9, he would have to pay a +1 for D7 and D8, as well as the interior terrain effect, which is always going to be +1 for fire that originates from inside and never leaves the factory, or it's +2 if it's a fortified location. And it only costs you one movement factor to move around inside the factory. It's still two to enter, but once you're inside, you only have to pay one movement factor. You also must be aware of the kindling and spreading fire rules because there's going to be a lot of fire in this game. The Chinese player has 4 blazes, which are randomly determined where they start, and depending on how you roll, even though the EC conditions are moderate, you could get a lot of fire, a lot of flame, and if you have wind, a lot of dispersed smoke. So knowing how all that rules is kind of critical to this scenario. So speaking of the SSRs, let's look at that. So as we said, EC are moderate. which means there's no diral modifier for flame. And woods burn on a 7, buildings on an 8, and stone buildings on a 9. The only modifier you would pay, barring any wind change, would be the -2 for not being directly attached. So you still need a high roll. And in our game, Dave got a lot of high rolls that he wasted on the fire. And luckily, well, not so luckily for the Japanese, he got all those low rolls when he was shooting at the Japanese. It's kind of funny. Um, yeah, so the Chinese have 4 blaze counters, which you can put down. We'll go into all that, how that's done. And finally, the Chinese can fortify 3 locations of the factory 20E7. So there's, 11 hexes in that building. You have to pick 3 that you can fortify. And each non-prisoner Chinese in the factory is going to be considered fanatic as well, which makes it very hard to get into the place depending on where you set up the factory or the fortified locations, either these 3 or these 2 or some combination thereof. It's going to be very difficult for the Japanese to penetrate if you have enough troops and you keep rotating them on a cycle basis. You bring back your unconcealed guys, gain concealment while your concealed guys move forward. So you always have some troops in those locations and hopefully concealed, because there will be a lot of Japanese knocking on the door with all their firepower. All right, so let's look at those blaze counters. So as I said in the SSR, you have 4 counters which start on 20J3, and from here you do a random location die roll, halving and rounding up the colored dice. So in direction 5 for 3 for the first one, 1, 2, 3. Now we have 4 ground level locations which the blaze can be set in. So we're just going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. 2, 3, 4. So it's going to be between the bottom 2, 1, 2. So it's going to be this guy right here. You just eliminate the buildings until you find one level, which is really close to the objective. This is a good for the Chinese, not so good for the Japanese. Next one. We're going to go 1 for 2. So the woods are going to be on fire, which is probably going to interfere with a Japanese fire base up here, and so forth. You just keep going. 1 for 1, and now we have 2 choices: the wood, stone, wood, stone. So the wood. And then lastly, we go 2 for 3. 1, 2, 3. Again, we have 4 to choose from. So starting at the top, and 1, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it'll be you. All right, so this pretty well precludes any fire base up top here. So you can see how the blazes work, and every scenario is going to be different because you always start with your 4 blazes in the center here, and then you just spread them out. And remember too, you got the 3 fortified positions for the Chinese. It doesn't matter which hex you choose. Obviously, you're going to have some combination of these 4 frontline locations, or you may have 2 and then a third one back here, somewhere maybe in the middle, just to throw it off a little bit. And unfortunately, you don't know which way the Japanese can go, but depending on how your blazes end up, drifting smoke, spreading flame, what have you, and your own fire, you might be able to limit the choices that the Japanese has. Many attacks could come down the west side, or maybe on the more riskier east side, but if you have any kind of Chinese firepower down here, you're probably going to do a lot of damage and therefore prevent that from happening. All right, so let's look at the orders of battle. We're going to start off with the attacker first. Now, the Japanese order of battle has 13 of these first line 447s, as well as 6 second line 347s, and then finally 3 228 infantry crews for your medium and heavy machine guns. These must be occupied, or I should say manned, by a 228. Otherwise, you pay penalty, 1 rate of fire, and your breakdown goes down to 10. Since it's already an 11, that's bad enough. A breakdown of 10 means you're probably not going to get a lot of action out of these, so just keep them with your crews, if you will. All right, before we get too far, let's look at the step-down procedure for Japanese MMCs. Now, if an armed, non-berserk Japanese squad fails an IFT morale check or collateral bombardment at final protective fire, but does not suffer casualty reduction, you don't get a K number, for example, or breaks due to a KIA result, because in a stack, if one unit's KIA, all the other units are automatically broken. In this case, you would do this step reduction as well. or if you should be hit with a sniper attack of 1, you're always going to be affected in the following ways. We're going to start off with the 447 because it's the most common unit in our order of battle. So if full strength, 447 fails a morale check but does not exceed his ELR, he gets replaced or flipped over to his stripe side. Note that the stripe side still has a 1 smoke exponent. Should this step reduced squad suffer a further morale check and ELR, but does not exceed his ELR, then he's replaced with a first line half squad. Should our 447 friend here fail morale check and fail his ELR, he will be replaced with a striped lower quality second line 237. And should our second line stripe 237 fail a morale check and exceed its ELR, it would be replaced with a 126 conscript half squad. All right, so as long as you don't exceed your ELR, you just go from unstriped to stripe side, and then from stripe side to unbroken half squad. Once you're in a half squad state, you can then be broken as per normal. When it comes to exceeding ELR, then you get replaced with a lower quality of unit, but you're still considered good order. So all these stripe units are still considered to be in good order. For any other break result, so when we start talking about voluntarily breaking or bailing out, parachute landings, that kind of things. For all those other cases, it's done in the following way. A full strength squad would be replaced with 2 broken half squads. Right? That's if they fail those other causes. If it's a reduced strength, then it's exchanged for 1 broken half squad. In all cases, should in the process of making a morale check you roll an original 12, then casualty reduction will happen in the normal manner to all types of Japanese personnel. So any berserk or unarmed Japanese squad that suffers any type of break result suffers casualty reduction instead of step reduction. Right? So if our 447 was in a if he was berserk and charging, and he gets a morale check failure, in this case he would be replaced with an unbroken. It can get a little overwhelming. Hopefully this diagram isn't too confusing for you. Just remember that assuming you don't break ELR, you just take your counter, you flip it over to the stripe side. Should you fail your morale check but not your ELR, you just swap it out with a half squad of the same class. When it comes to ELR failure, then you start replacing it with lower quality troops until such point you're stuck with half squads, and those can be broken as per normal. So casualty reduction would work the same way. Assuming this 447 rolled an original 12 when it's morale check, it would be replaced with a half squad, which would then have to go through the process of switching to a lower quality of troops and being broken. So this 237 would turn into a 127. All right, so let's, I think that's enough of that. Again, this may take a little bit of doing to figure out, but you just have to play the Japanese a couple times and it should come pretty good. Last things we'll talk about the MMCs and we'll move on is remember your smoke exponents. So elite and first line Japanese all have smoke capability. The elite has a smoke exponent of 2, so should you be lucky enough to battle harden to a 448, then your smoke exponent goes up, and you also have the capability of using white phosphorus. So it's only elite units that'll have that white phosphorus capability. You're always considered stealthy as first line and elite, provided you're not in a Banzai. If you contribute to a Banzai, then you're going to become lax at the for the duration of that player turn. All right, let's look at the leaders. Now we have 4 Japanese leaders in the order of battle. We have a 10-1, a 10-0, a 9-1, and a 9-0. They are treated very much like commissars in terms of rally and berserk purposes. So should you have a stack of units that are with a Japanese leader and he goes berserk, then the units will automatically go berserk as well. There's no rolling required. You just automatically become Berserk. And similarly, should you be in the half squad formation and you're a broken half squad, and normally you're subject to desperation morale. Should you have a Japanese leader with you, the DM obviously you ignore and you conduct normally. Now that also means that should this unit fail to rally, then much like a commissar, if it's the lowest quality troop, will be eliminated because it's only a half squad. But if it is a first or second line, then it would get replaced with a lower quality troop. One other benefit for the Japanese leader is the increase of morale for any non-berserk units. So when you start contributing to a one stack Banzai charge, for example, it really helps to have that extra morale boost just to help you endure any kind of attack that comes along. The Japanese leaders never break. Rather, all you can do is wound them, much like a hero. They take a wound, provided they pass their wound severity die roll, 4 or less, then they'll be alive. Should they suffer another casualty reduction, for example, they fail their morale check after already being wounded, then they would be eliminated because you can only be wounded once. Should roll a original 12 for a morale check, it will eliminate the leader. On the other hand, you never suffer pins and or ELR replacement. And then finally, fitting with the samurai image, the single man counter can perform an infantry overrun. So if you have an enemy leader just sitting there in the open, by all means, charge him with your samurai. All right, last thing we'll look at is some other general stuff. So we've already discussed the mediums and heavies, and again, why they must be affiliated with an infantry crew. You also have 5 LMGs to give to your squads. Bear in mind, again, you only have a range of 6, and your breakdown is 11. So hopefully you can get some use out of them. All in all, with the 19 squads and the 5 LMGs, that is plenty of firepower to make your attack. And having this as a side for Overwatch is just a bonus. Now let's discuss the Banzai. Generally, this is done as per a human wave. So if you've never done a human wave, in essence, you need to have 3 adjacent squads, or excuse me, locations, with an average of 2 squads per location. You must also have a leader to conduct a human wave. Pick an enemy and you all charge forward in that line. When it comes to the Japanese Banzai, you can have a unit by itself declare a Banzai. It does not require multiple squads, nor does it require a leader. The only time you require a leader is if you have more than one squad. So you can have a stack Banzai. You could have several adjacent hexes, all Banzai, much in the way of a human wave. It generally follows those principles, but you have a little bit more flexibility. Another benefit to the Banzai over the human wave is your ability to attack an adjacent target. So say we have a Chinese unit adjacent, we can declare a Banzai. These units here will declare it, and they'll just conduct their attack as per normal. As opposed to a normal human wave where you must be at least 2 hexes away. You cannot declare a human wave if you are adjacent to an enemy unit. You must be at least 2 hexes away, which is, again, the difference between a Banzai and a human wave. So when you set your units up for a Banzai, the last point you have to remember is once you reach your target, again, assume there's a Chinese unit here, all these units make their way forward. Once they enter close combat, you're considered lax, so which means you're going to be getting a +1 to your ambush die roll. All right, which sucks if you're in a building, obviously, when ambush or woods, because that's the only place where you can have ambush. When it comes to open terrain, obviously, you don't have to worry about that. However, when it comes to charging units in buildings, be aware that you will be considered lax for the duration of that player turn. When it comes to close combat for Japanese units, they always opt for hand-to-hand if they are the attacker, or they gain ambush. So if you're a defender and you successfully gain ambush, you can use hand-to-hand to fight off whoever attacks you. In addition, Japanese always receive an extra -1 DRM unless they're pinned or unarmed. So whenever you're in combat, just remember the Japanese unit gets an extra -1 to its die roll. So last thing we'll talk about then is the Harikari, and this is done by the Japanese to prevent capture. So in the course of a close combat or a melee, should your opponent decide to try and capture you instead, you do have the option of taking your own life and thereby denying him your interrogation. He still gets VP for you, but you deny him the chance for interrogation, so it might be a useful tactic. The way it works is you take a normal task check, and with some modifiers, for example, if a unit precedes you having done it successfully, it's a modifier. If you're with a leader who's going to do it with you, there's a modifier. I'm not going to get into that, but you can look that up in the Chapter G rules. It is an option available to you as a Japanese. Now, the consequence of failure, should you fail your attempt, your opponent's going to be getting a -1 to his capture attempt. Now, if you look at the close combat chart, and if you look at a capture attempt, it's already at a +1, so now it's going to be 0. Should you be an inexperienced unit, then you'll get a -2 to your capture attempt. So you're more than likely to not to be captured, again, depending on the modifiers and the die rolls. All right, moving on to happier subjects, let's talk about the nationalist Chinese. Now, this order of battle has 12 elite 447s. And again, they also have a smoke exponent of 1, so don't be afraid to use it to cover your lateral movement as you try and close in on the factory. You also have 4 first-line 337s, and then rounding it off, you have 2 227 half squads. Now, normally Chinese cannot deploy, so these are OB given, which means you can use them as such. Either use them to man your heavy weapons, or you could put them forward to maybe act like speed bumps, maybe intercept a Banzai charge, or coupled with some concealment counters may prove a tempting target. You never know. Chinese can attempt a human wave as the Russians. So again, as we just discussed with the Japanese, you must have at least 3 adjacent hexes with an average of 2 per hex, and you must have a leader handy. And then you can conduct your human wave if you so choose. You also have the option, 10% of your squads as dare death squads. Now, there's only full squads, not half squads. So in this example, we have 16 full squads, which means 1.6, round up to 2. You can have 2 squads, which will act as dare death. These must be pre-recorded. The way you use dare death is if you're adjacent to a leader who is unpinned and in good order, and both units have line of sight to an enemy, then you can voluntarily go berserk. All right, so you conduct your charge, you close in on the enemy as a normal berserk. The difference between a dare death berserk and a normal berserk is at the end of that player turn, unless you're in melee, you will become non-dare death. You'll revert back to normal. Now the difference is, for example, when the your target is broken and he will rout away. If the normal berserk unit, you would have to pick a new target because you cannot revert until you've destroyed an enemy in close combat. And so that does not apply in this case for the dare death. At the end of that player turn, they'll be reverting back to normal. Again, unless you're locked in melee. The dare death only, resolve hand to hand as if you're Japanese. So again, if you win ambush or if you're the attacker, you can opt for hand to hand only for the dare death. And finally, each non-hand to hand versus personnel attack with an unpinned dare death squad gets an extra -1 DRM in their close combat die roll. So it becomes easier to kill you when you're dare death, but you do get some benefits, especially if you're under strength and you're going against a bigger stack, because that tends to favor hand-to-hand combat more. Now the Chinese only have 3 leaders, and that includes 2 neg-1s. Now we're going to get into the train tactics in a second, but what's probably a good use for your neg-1 leaders is to stack with your machine guns in 1 or 2 different optimal locations to start laying down fire lanes. Have a neg-1 leader with your fire lane. It's an excellent way to start whittling away the Japanese attackers. And leave your 7-0 probably in the factory You can leave it in the center interior hex, and as your outside units are impacted, affected, they can retreat into him. He can rally them and then bring them back. Remember, in a factory, you're also fanatic, so your units become 448s instead, and therefore they're much easier to rally as well. It's going to be a constant battle between the Japanese trying to reduce the defenders, while the Chinese is throwing in fresh, hopefully concealed units in their place at the front line. To go along with that, again, you also have 10 concealment counters. Now, whether you use these as dummy stacks or to cover up your frontline units, or even if you want to cover up all your units and just forgo dummy stacks, again, that's going to be your choice. It will usually not take long for an opponent to figure out what's a dummy and what's not, depending on how it moves. And because when we get to the terrain analysis, you're going to see there's several open areas. Once you move into open area and line of sight, you're going to be gone anyways. So you might be better served to maybe have one or maybe two dummy stacks, and the rest will probably cover your own units. And then lastly, you also have 3 fortified locations. So for the Chinese, there's 11 hexes that you have to cover. You only have 3 building fortifications. Now, depending on, well, you won't know obviously until the Japanese show up, but depending on where these flames land, may help you decide where you want to put your fortified building locations. If this row house becomes on fire because of random die rolls, then it's less likely the Japanese are going to be able to use this as a launching point. So then you can maybe lean more to the west side. On the other hand, should this area become kindled by you and you turn this into a firestorm, then you maybe pre-planning that you could set up along this formation. Again, it's entirely up to you how you want to do it, but where you have flames and or your kindling strategy will probably determine the likely location of where those are going to be. All right, with all that being said, let's look at the terrain. So to describe the battle space, we're going to use the Koka factors. This is a military intelligence tool used to define, like I said, the battle space. It outlines things like observation fields of fire, where the key terrain is, avenues of approach, that kind of thing. This helps to break the battle space down into manageable chunks. First up is observation and fields of fire. Now, this is going to be from both perspectives. So let's start with the Japanese. Now, there's 2 locations, this one and this one here, maybe this one, that could be used as Overwatch. So you can set up your HMG, maybe your mediums with one of your Neg 1 leaders, setting them up in a high point, and that way, especially this location, he's got good coverage of this whole area. He can cover anything that tries to filter in from east to west. So if the Chinese player sets up some units in this location, having Overwatch on here would help deteriorate that. Of course, the big unknown is where the blazes are going to end up. I like this vantage point here just because it does offer you eyes on this location as well as this location. This 1.5 level row house you can see over, as long as you're going to have 2 blind hexes, but that means you can see these 2 locations. So it's not a bad spot for your heavies. Of course, the flip side to that is you can't see anything that's east of basically this. You can't see anything east of that. Now, that means all this here is going to be unmolested by you. Again, depending on where the flames are and where the Chinese sets up, this may be a viable option. You're going to have plenty of 2.5 level buildings to use. This is a nice one defenders can set up in here. Again, be wary of where the flames land. Obviously, if you're stuck in this location, there's only the one stairwell, so do not be up on an upper level if the ground floor catches, because should this turn into a blaze, your only recourse is to climb out and risk falling. So just be wary of that. But this is a good central point for you to use as a bastion, again, depending where these end up. One disadvantage for the Japanese up in these locations is this row house. Because it's going to be 1.5 level, it's going to give you at least 2, maybe 3 blind hexes depending on distance, and therefore you will not be able to see the factory itself. So again, this X2 position is only really good for cutting off any Chinese elements in the east, whereas this one here in BB4 would offer you some fire onto the factory, but you're limited to that eastern forces. For the Chinese now, There's two locations that are key. The first one is this one here, because it gives you a nice 12 hex fire lane, which you can use your HMG for. And the second one is in this location, which for the same reason. This is only a 10 hex range, and you use your medium in that location. Again, you have a 9-1 and an 8-1. Nothing wrong with keeping your leaders in that kind of formation. And again, depending on what's going on with this stuff, you also have the option of reinforcing your factory coming in from the south. So if your factory starts to become depleted, you do have a wall protection to offer you some cover, and you should be able to make your way around. Again, you will have to worry about any kind of overwatch, depending entirely on the blazes and or this blind hexes from this row house, but it is an option. But having some kind of cutoff in these locations, I think, is very key to the Chinese plan. One thing to be aware of as a Chinese defender is the Japanese Banzai. So in our game that we just played, Dave had a unit in this location, and I was stacked over here somewhere. And one of these hexes, I think this one right here, had eyes on this location, so I was able to declare a Banzai, and before you know it, I was already down here by turn 2, which meant I could move into position and then start bringing fire on by turn 3 or even turn 4. Just be aware of that as a Chinese player, that if you have a unit too far forward, a Japanese sees it, he's probably going to Banzai it because it's an extra move bonus that he can capitalize on. When it comes to cover and concealment, you can use the OB given concealment for the Chinese player. You can set them up forward as dummy stacks, or you can cover up your own units. Because the way the process normally works is, say for example, a Japanese sets up here on the second level, and you have a unit here on the ground level. You would have to wait for setup to be complete to determine if LOS exists. If it doesn't, then you would gain concealment. But rather than do that, you can just give yourself the good old concealment and be in the front line if you so choose. Obviously not recommended, because there's so much Japanese firepower coming for you, you're quickly going to get whittled away. It might be better to have a in-depth defense than to put yourself forward. So I don't see too much use for dummy stacks, not to negate them because they still serve a purpose, but I think more experienced players will quickly deduce what's a dummy stack and what's not. Ultimately, it's not going to matter because this is the objective, and most of the Japanese force is going to be coming down this way anyways, because again, they must secure this. This is just a luxury to deal with, and with 6.5 turns, it's not a lot of time. When it comes to the interior factory, as a defender, again, skulking is an excellent idea. The problem with that, of course, is if you vacate these locations, especially the fortified ones, then a Japanese can just quickly move in, and now you're fighting him in a fortified location. So what you have to do is not skulk, but so much as rotate your troops. As they become visible, either concealment's busted or maybe they're broken, they retreat into the interior where your 7-0 is. He rallies them. They gain concealment, hopefully. And then in your next turn, they can come in and replace the broken squad that is probably now going to be there from all that mass Japanese fire. So if you can work out a cycle of rotating in fresh units, hopefully concealed into your front lines, you'll have a better chance of withstanding the barrage. Also, Japanese first lines and the Chinese first lines, or elites, I should say, do have smoke grenade capability. So when it comes to the Chinese trying to reinforce the factory, don't forget your smoke grenades. And the Japanese trying to cross these fire lane alleys, don't forget to use your smoke grenades either. As I see it, there's only two obstacles really to this, and the biggest one is a randomness. Again, where did those end up? You have no idea. In our playthrough, we had pretty well this whole area here was all on fire. It was a beautiful thing to behold. We didn't even have wind. That's without wind, we had this whole area on fire. So you start tacking on heavy winds, gusts maybe, you start jumping roads, and suddenly most of the map is ablaze. In addition, as a Chinese defender, it's probably advisable to try and kindle these buildings here, just to deny them access to the Japanese, especially B4. If you can get rid of that, then they're pretty well stuck with this row house, and you have a better chance of controlling them, especially if you have your fire lanes in this kind of location. The only other obstacle that you might face is going to be for the fortified building itself for the Japanese. Once you've identified where these locations are, because they will be set up hip until you use their effect modifier, and then they'll become known. Until you find that out, you don't know where they are. You can assume, but you won't know for sure until you find out probably the hard way. And then you're going to have to come up with strategy to try and come around it, either flanking on either side. In Dave's case, he actually had a one of his fortification was in this location. I think it was like this. So he set up heavy on the west side, and wouldn't you know it, I tried to do a flank and to go around it. I knew this one was clear, but he kept putting units in, so I was never able to engage these effectively. Again, they were getting cut up. So I tried a west flank, and that's when I found out he had that one fortified. So that was a good use of that. It caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting it. But as a Japanese player, you're going to have to identify where those are, and then you're going to have to find a way around them if you don't have enough firepower to break them. I was doing 12 firepower attacks after having, and I was still not breaking them quickly enough. Again, I blame the dice for that one because I was rolling mediocre, whereas Dave was rolling a lot of threes and fives for his attacks on me. All right, when it comes to key terrain, again, there's only two things I see. Obviously, the factory itself. This is the win or lose scenario for both sides. Secondly, for the Japanese, I think it's critical that you either control B4 or these three row houses at least, maybe the whole thing. The reason why is you need to have some kind of fire base in this location. First of all, it's a +3, not a +2, or even in the open. It keeps you out of the way of the fire lanes, assuming that they're set up, and allows you some good cover to have massed fire attacks against these locations. Should you manage to break these or vacate them, maybe you're lucky enough to get a K, who knows? You might even have an opportunity to dash across the road, but uh, Japanese definitely have to secure this and B4 at a minimum. Again, this is why it might be advisable for the Chinese player to start kindling, maybe even try kindling the stone. It burns on a 9, no EC modifiers, so it's not unconceivable that you could set this row house on fire. The last thing I'll mention is about the vehicle entrance. Again, it's not going to apply in this scenario because there's no vehicles, but that is one of the few ways a vehicle can enter a building without bogging too much. It still has to take a bog check, but it's not as severe as crashing into the side. So for purposes of this scenario, you can probably ignore this. All right, lastly, we'll look at the avenues of approach, and this is from a Japanese perspective. Now, again, there's only two ways I see this happening. One, your entire force comes along the west side, tries to secure some advantage in these row houses, and then works its way in. The other option is to send a smaller force this way to deal with whatever remnants of Chinese are here, while your main assault force continues on its way to the west. If you can pin down sizable numbers of Chinese, either by having your fire base or by sending in units, it's less troops that you have to deal with inside the factory. So that is a viable option. If you can dominate, anywhere in here, and there's still Chinese units on this side, you'll be able to keep them from supporting their attacks on the factory. But that's the two avenues of approach that I can see. And there we have it. Initial Recce for Shanghai in Flames, scenario number 145. Again, this is the 2021 Rising Sun version, not the earlier ones. Again, the difference is one squad, I think, for the IGA. I'm not sure about the rest. I don't have those scenarios, so I don't know what the difference is. But it seems to be a highly favored scenario, notwithstanding my 8 rating that it gave it. It's relatively short, can be done in a few hours. And it's a nice introduction to the Pacific Theater where there's lots of rules that you also have to learn in addition to the normal ones. You start off with just infantry and support weapons, so it's easier to manage your introduction to it than throwing in caves and all the rest of it, which we're going to get to. So I'm glad that we were able to play this scenario. It was fun. I ended up losing the first one that we played. We're going to do this again. I just was not able to penetrate the factory good enough. I was able to take one hex back, but then the minute I do, he kills it, and he comes back in and occupies it. So with his fire bases, I wasn't able to do any flanking like I was showing. And the one time I did try it, sure enough, it was a fortified location. So it was an interesting battle. I really like it. And if you've never tried a Banzai charge, this is a scenario to try it in, I think. So hopefully you enjoyed that. Let me know if you like it or comments or if I made any errors. Excuse me. By all means, please comment down below, and I'll see you guys next video. Bye bye.